classifying quadrilaterals. There are different types of quadrilaterals, and you must use the properties of quadrilaterals to identify and classify them. Similar to triangles, quadrilaterals are classified by relationships between their sides and angles. A trapezium has exactly one pair of parallel sides. In this quadrilateral right here, you'll notice there are markings, these arrows. The arrows indicate that the top and the bottom are parallel to each other. The top line and the bottom line form a pair of parallel sides, and that is the only pair of parallel sides in this quadrilateral, therefore it is a trapezium. The left and right sides, if we were to extend these out, this would go straight up and this side would slant in and eventually they would intersect. So the left and right are not parallel. Looking at the other two examples, we can say exactly the same thing. The arrows indicate that the top and bottom are parallel, and since the top line and bottom line are a pair, this has exactly one pair of parallel sides. Therefore, this meets the definition of a trapezium. Furthermore, this shape here, or any of these shapes, seem to indicate that only the top and bottom are parallel. However, if I rotate these objects around, they still contain one pair of parallel sides. Therefore, they still meet the definition of a trapezium. Let's turn our attention to a discussion on a shape called kites. A kite has exactly two pairs of adjacent sides that are congruent, or equal in length. The opposite sides are not congruent, or not equal in length. First of all, adjacent means next to. So by looking at the markings here on the right-hand side, we see the two blue markings mean that the two line segments next to each other, or the two sides, are congruent. Same thing can be said down here with the two sides that are adjacent or next to each other with the two red markings. They are congruent or equal in length. Also notice that opposite sides are not congruent or not equal in length. So opposite of this is this longer side, and the same could be said for the upper right and the lower left. Making this more concrete, let's take a look at an example with numbers. Here we have a kite laying on its side, and you'll notice that the upper left and lower left are both 3 centimeters, and the upper right and lower right are both 5.5 centimeters. This meets the definition of a kite. A parallelogram has opposite sides that are congruent or equal in length, and at the same time, opposite sides are also parallel. That's what these markings are indicating to us. You'll notice two sets of markings on each line segment. For this one, the opposite sides, you'll have a blue marking for the top and the bottom, meaning that those two sides are congruent, and you'll see a double set of red arrows indicating that those two sides are also parallel. If I go left and right, you'll notice that on the left side, there's a double blue marking on both the left and right side, indicating that those two sides are congruent, equal in length, and you'll see a single red arrow on the left and right, indicating that those opposite sides are also parallel. Since the opposite sides are congruent and parallel, this meets the definition of a parallelogram. And the same can be said for all three shapes that you're looking at on this slide. An interesting fact is that the opposite angles of a parallelogram are also congruent. So you'll see these semicircle markings for angles A and angle D, saying that those two sides are congruent, and the double semicircles for both angle C and angle B indicate that those opposite angles are also congruent. Rectangles. A rectangle is a special parallelogram with 4 right angles. All of the properties that we discussed with parallelograms are true for rectangles. So with rectangles, opposite sides are congruent and parallel, and opposite angles are equal, congruent. What distinguishes a rectangle from a parallelogram is the fact that a rectangle has 4 right angles. Rhombus. A rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent or equal sides and opposite angles congruent or equal in measure. The plural of rhombus is rhombi. When you look at these shapes here, the markings indicate that all 4 sides are congruent. That meets the definition of a rhombus. and the opposite sides are also congruent or equal in measure. So the single semicircles indicate that these two angles are the same measure, congruent, and the double semicircles indicate that these two opposite angles are also congruent, equal in measure. So these are both rhombi. The plural is singular would be rhombus. An interesting question is, are these rhombi regular? And the answer would be no. These are irregular polygons because in order for a shape to be regular, all four angles and all four sides would have to be congruent. In this case, all four angles are not congruent. A square is a rhombus with four right angles or a rectangle with four congruent or equal sides. So we'll notice by the markings in all three of these squares, they all contain right angles, and all right angles are congruent to each other. We also notice by the markings that all four sides are the same. The single marking means that all four of these angles or sides are the same length. The triple markings on each side of this large square shows that they're all the same length, and the double markings on this medium-sized square show that they're all the same length. So a square has four congruent sides and four right angles. It's also interesting to note that a square is a regular polygon.